We're back. That's all I can say is we're back, and I'm excited that we are back. How you doing, baby queen? I've missed you.
I'm good. Welcome back. It's exciting to be
Welcome
back
back.
back in the studio having these conversations again.
Yes, and I love uh, the start. I guess this is the premiere of our new season, and this is definitely, um, I think, a perfect way to get us started, to get us back into the swing of things. Um, we took a little hiatus, and I think it was well deserved. We went strong, keeping everyone informed and enlightened and educated about the lived Black experience throughout the pandemic.
Mhm.
And I mean, we really hit it hard and strong and wrapped it up with a great community Juneteenth celebration here in Flagstaff. And so now we're back. What say you about that?
Yes, I fully agree with you. I think the summer was a good time for some good rest and just gearing up to dive back in and have these conversations again. I'm excited to see what we'll be talking about this season, and yeah, just excited to launch back in.
I think it's great. And I hear my friend, and I've also missed my feline friend back there. So hi, I've missed you too. And
Right on cue.
here we are inclusive of everyone, and even our feline friends. Um, oh wow, we seem to have lost Miss House temporarily. We'll get her back in. But we're excited to have our special guest this evening that is going to enlighten us, to inform, to educate us on America's first Black city or town, and I'm really excited about this evening's presentation. Uh, I'm excited to learn this evening. I think when I first heard of this town, I heard it referred to as a village. You're back. Unmute yourself so we can hear what you have to say. You're back. I
See,
was
does
just
that
I was just sharing with the audience that when I first heard about this location, I first heard of it referred to as a village.
mm,
I always was intrigued by that, and I often wondered if it had any association with Africa.
mm.
I think I was in elementary school when I first heard of this city. So I don't want to give away too much. So I'm really excited about this evening. What have you been thinking about this presentation?
Yeah, I will admit I had not heard of Brooklyn, Illinois, and I actually have a question about that for later because of just the places that we do hear about and the places that we don't. I'll just say that
Yeah,
for now, and just the question of why it is that there's that distinction, but reading about it and learning a little bit about it ahead of this. I'm very curious to hear the good doctor's presentation and just learn together more about this
absolutely.
history and all that goes along with it. I'll just say that I don't want to spoil anything.
Absolutely. And how exciting it is to have Chi Town on in the studio this evening. And so, with that being said, take it away. I'll see you on the other side.
All right. Well, good evening once again to our audience. Again, it is so exciting to be back with you and to be diving back into these conversations. And it is my pleasure to introduce our topic for the evening, Founded by Chance, Sustained by Courage, the story of Brooklyn, Illinois, America's first Black town. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Sundiata Cha-Jua. The good doctor teaches in the departments of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois. He is the author of several articles, op-ed commentaries, and books, including his text on our subject tonight, America's First Black Town, Brooklyn, Illinois, 1830 to 1915. He is a founding scholar and trainer of the Policing in a Multiracial Society program, which provides systematic anti-racial bias education and training for police recruits attending the University of Illinois' Police Training Institute, and researches the racial attitudes of police and the effectiveness of anti-racist training. Engaged with local and national Black liberation movement organizations since his teen years, he has been a member of the executive board of the St. Louis-based Organization for Black Struggles, or OBS, a member of the National Council of the Black Radical Congress, and is an organizer for the Malcolm X grassroots movement. Welcome.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really intrigued and thrilled by this program that you have all the way out in Flagstaff, Arizona, that focuses on local communities, local Black communities. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight.
Thank you so much. Well, I will turn it over to you and let you go into your presentation. And yeah, we'll come back with questions for our audience. As just a reminder, at the end of the presentation, we will turn it over to you for questions. So if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please share them in the chat and we will ask them during our live Q&A.
Okay. So the presentation is entitled Fight the Power, Brooklyn, Illinois, and the Black Nationalist Tradition of Town Building. Okay, I was good. What you see now are two map images. The one on the left is a map of the state of Illinois, and it identifies New Philadelphia, which was the first town in the then United States, founded by a person of African descent, Frank McWhorter, founded in 1936. And then you come on down and you see Brooklyn. Brooklyn is in the American Bottoms, which is a floodplain that borders the Mississippi River. To the right is the highlighted purple area would be the town of Brooklyn. So the motto of the town is founded by chance, sustained by courage. And what's important here is that the motto captures the essence of the town's history. That is to say that where it was founded was indeed by chance, but that it was sustained through struggle, hard work, right? Courage. Now, in this presentation today, I'm going to approach it in the following fashion. So, one, I'm going to talk about what I mean by America's first Black town. There's a lot of speculation, and there have been a number of other places who have challenged that designation. And so I want to clarify some things in regard to the historicity of Brooklyn, Illinois. I also want to make the strong argument, and I want to make it in the strongest possible terms, and that is that the practice of Black town building, and we're talking about maybe 100 towns built between 1880 and 1920, that practice is representative of a political philosophy that we'll call proto-nationalism, Some people refer to it as community nationalism, and I'll explain in greater detail in a moment. I want to also just kind of register the importance of Black towns in the history of the African American people, but also to talk about what are the implications that we sought to build these all Black communities. Now, we're going to, in terms of Brooklyn, the place that we're going to focus on, Brooklyn has also been referred to as Lovejoy. That's it's the kind of what happened is that there was another town in the state of Illinois that also had the name Brooklyn. And so when it came to mail delivery, that would be confusing. So Black Brooklyn received the name Lovejoy for its post office, right? Post office address, Lovejoy, Illinois. And people began to refer to the entirety of the town by the post office address, right? But so we're going to look at Brooklyn in three arcs. We're going to talk about the founding period. We're going to look at the period of what I'm calling Black Power. And in the period of Black Power, we'll be looking at the rise of Black political control, but we will also be looking at the incorporation of Black labor into the meatpacking industry, into the railroad industry, and to the dominant industries that would develop in what's called the Metro East. That is to say, the Illinois side of the Mississippi River across from St. Louis, Missouri. And we'll be looking at dependence, that is to say, the underdevelopment of the Black community relative to white communities. Now, I'm also using this discussion, my understanding is that this is that the Live Black experience is a group of people who are engaged in reconstruction and telling the story of the Flagstaff Black community. So I want to use this discussion to also illustrate the viability of a social history methodology or approach to the reconstruction of Black life in history, right? So in that sense, we're going to, one, provide an overview of the history of Black Brooklyn. Two, we're going to focus, laser focus. The bulk of our conversation will be about the life of John Evans, known as the father of Brooklyn, Illinois. Evans was the town's first elected African-American mayor. Now, historians, we talk about what we call interventions. That is to say, what is the unique contribution that we're making to a subject? What are the challenges, the arguments that we are presenting that go against the grain of the dominant literature? And I want to highlight three things here. That my main major intervention is to highlight the centrality of Black nationalism as a philosophy and practice of Black life. That it's not a aberrant, not a undercurrent. That is in fact a mainstream tributary of Black thought and practice. Two, I want to look at that dialectic of political autonomy when Black people have control of a town or city, and the relationship of Black control to economic dependency. That is to say, do they have control over the economics as well as the politics, right? And then third is that the book itself and this presentation is an effort to reorient the way in which we do African American history. In other words, much of the history is focused on the accomplishments of the Black middle class, either as individuals or as a collective class. And the argument kind of goes that the Black middle class led the African American community. I think that the data substantively demonstrates that That's a wrong-headed assertion. So I want to resituate the leadership of the Black working class in the community building process of the African American nation within a nation, as Martin Delaney described it. Okay, so what I mean when I say America's first Black town, and to be honest, that title is a title selected by the University of Illinois Marketing Division, right? Being an academic myself, my title was Proletarianization and Dependency in Brooklyn, Illinois, 1830 to 1950. Obviously, that was a title that I selected that wouldn't have sold a book, right? They came up with a much more catchier title, but their title was also true. Now, there were settlements that precede Brooklyn or take place about the same time. The first settlement, autonomous settlement of African people in the United States appears to be Fort Moses near San Antonio, Florida in about 1738, right? But 2 points here. One, Florida was not part of the United States at that time. And two, it's a settlement, right? It's not an incorporated town. Princeton, North Carolina is another place that likes to claim itself as the first Black town. Some people also like to talk about Boley, Oklahoma. There's conversation about Mound Bayou, Mississippi. But the truth is that when we say town, town is a specific meaning in a nation state, right? Like the United States. And that meaning is that it's incorporated. It's not just a place where people live, but it's a place that legally has been platted and incorporated and given certain governmental powers. So when I say Brooklyn, Illinois is America's first Black town, I mean that it is the first place with an overwhelming Black majority controlled by Black folk that is incorporated as a town via the laws of states in Illinois, states in the United States. Okay, so I mean specifically incorporation. That is the first place to be incorporated. There are other places. There's maroon communities where Black people took up space, residence, but these are not organized towns under U.S. law. So that's my point, right? Now, in terms of this notion of proto-nationalism, what we're talking about is on two levels. One, philosophically, the other, institutionally. So idea and practice, thought and practice. Proto-nationalism as a thought, right? As a way of thinking, what it basically does is express an attitude on the part of Black people, belief that they should have the right to define themselves, that they should be able to set the terms by which they develop, and to determine their own destiny. So when we say proto-nationalism, we mean a set of ideas that speak in that direction. Now, what differs from a straight up nationalist stance is that proto-nationalists do not necessarily envision an independent nation state, right? What they envision is autonomy, Black control of neighborhoods, of communities, of towns, Black institutions, churches, clubs, associations, newspapers, etc. Not necessarily, right? An autonomous Black nation state. So it's something short of a nation state. And of course, I think the data is very clear that that is the preferred uh, ideological position of African American people. Now, what I have before you now is a quote from the third State of the Union address. Well, they didn't call them State of the Unions, but that's essentially what it was, by the 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, the individual who would succeed Abraham Lincoln. Now, after emancipation, debates in Congress, positions put forward in newspapers and magazines question the capacity of people of African descent for self-government. One of the people, one of the most prominent people to make the argument that African folk were incapable of governing themselves was, of course, President Andrew Johnson. So Johnson's quote is, but, excuse me, is there a way that we can enlarge the slide? But let me read. But if anything can be proved by known facts, if all reasoning upon evidence is not abandoned, it must be acknowledged that in the process of nations, Negroes have shown less capacity for self-government than other races. No independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands. On the contrary, wherever they have been left to their own devices, they have shown a constant tendency to relapse into barbarism, unquote. Now, that belief is not just Johnson's, but it's shared by the broad intelligentsia and the average people in the United States. I don't know that I need to say that it is blatantly false, right? That clearly they have no understanding of uh, African societies. They have no memory of the fact that it was African folks who controlled for 700 years, right? Spain and etc. But the point is that they believed that African people lacked the capacity for self-government. So in beginning this research, I obviously wanted to refute that notion. And the way to refute that notion, can I get the slide moved? The way to refute that notion is to study Black towns, right? A space in which Black people have political control. That gives us an opportunity to see what Black folks do with self-government, right? In conjunction, I also wanted to explore and look at the extent to which political autonomy, that is to say, Black people controlling a political entity, and economic development, to what extent are these things going to be shaped by the racism in the society and by a capitalist political economy? To what extent will they be undermined? Okay, I'm moving slide. So we come to the founding of Brooklyn. And the key figure, well, yeah, the key person in the founding of Brooklyn, Illinois, is a woman by the name of Priscilla Baltimore. She's known in the history of Brooklyn as Mother Baltimore. Now, that mother has two distinct meanings, right? Well, I should say two intersecting meanings. On the one hand, it's she's an exhorter. She's a lay person who preaches in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So it speaks to the tendency to refer to women of stature who play a role in the founding of AME churches as mother, right? But she's also a founder or co-founder, but the primary person that leads to the founding of the town of Baltimore. And she lives an extremely long life, born enslaved, purchased her freedom, and she leads 11 families across the Mississippi River and into the American Bottoms, that area that I showed you earlier on the map. And there, for several years, they exist at some point as a kind of maroon community, meaning that they're there in the woods. At a later point, they consolidate, more people come, and they're kind of like what's called in the literature a freedom village, right? A freedom village. And at another point, then in 1837, a group of 5 white abolitionists who are also capitalists, i.e., they want to make money. They plat the area where this group of Black folk have been residing, and they give it the name Brooklyn. All right. So in 1837, you have a platted town, but it's unincorporated. At this point, it becomes a biracial community, but 7/8 of the population is African, people of African descent. Now, Priscilla Baltimore's husband, John Baltimore, who is a butcher by trade, right? Now, those 11 families that flee Missouri and come to Illinois, some of them are free people. That is to say, they're free before the Civil War. And some of them are enslaved people who are self-emancipating, meaning that they're taking their freedom. They're stealing themselves, right? And it's that group that comes together. But John Baltimore was a freeman. He's a butcher by trade. And this becomes important in terms of my overall thesis. He's able to, in 1841, he purchases 23 lots in what's then known as the town of Brooklyn, plus a fraction. And then he purchases another 3 lots in the area that's known as Upper Brooklyn, right? For $800. And again, so you can see he's a man of some wealth and substance. And then there's John Anderson, who's a carpenter by trade. He and his wife Matilda are part of the 11 families that crossed the Mississippi with Priscilla and John Baltimore. Now, he sets up and establishes the Antioch Missionary Baptist Church. So these are the 2 core institutions, two core religious institutions. Initially, Brooklyn African Methodist Episcopal Church and Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, right? Now, in the Brooklyn, in the area, it's created in Illinois in the 1830s, late 1830s. Well, in Illinois, like many northern states, you had the Black laws. Think of the Black laws as the equivalent of the slave laws in the enslaved South, right? But these are laws for quote unquote free Blacks, or really we should use the term quasi-free, right? That's a term coined by the eminent historian John Hope Franklin. And what he meant by quasi-free is that these people did not have the right to testify in court against a white person. They could not sue white people. In the state of Illinois, their children could not attend public school, but they still had to pay school taxes. So there's a whole series of limitations, right? If they were in the state, within 3 months, they had to post a bond for themselves. So real limitations. Now, as I said earlier, that in this period from the winter of 1830 through 1850, Brooklyn goes through a number of metamorphoses. On the one hand, it's a maroon community of people who are essentially hiding out because many of them escape. They're self-emancipated. Right? It becomes a freedom village, but it's unplatted, and then it's platted, and it becomes an unincorporated biracial town. Now, in looking at the history of of Brooklyn, Illinois, from the winter of 1830 through 1850, and I'm using the 1850 census for a lot of this data, right? What we find is that there are two core institutions that consolidate and help the Black community to congeal, you know, the Afro-Brooklynites. And those core institutions are family and church. Now I'm going to start with church. So there's a centrality to religion. Most Black folks in the United States in the 19th century are deeply, deeply, deeply religious people. In Brooklyn, the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, has a great significance because of Mother Baltimore. She's an exhorter in the AME tradition. Because of Reverend Paul Quinn, he eventually becomes an AME bishop, but he's the first person sent by the AME Church to preach the gospel of liberation west of the Alleghenies, and he, along with Priscilla Baltimore, helps in the structuring of the Brooklyn community and the building of that church. And indeed, Priscilla Baltimore, Paul Quinn, Ezekiel Pines, and others, they would make routine trips into St. Louis, Missouri, to help liberate and bring other folk to freedom, to non-slavery, right? Right? You couldn't say you were free in Illinois. You can say that you weren't enslaved. Reverend Jordan Winston Early would be the individual who would actually build the church physically as carpenter. Moving on. All right. Now, in addition to that institutional base, right, there's there's space, right? So there's a spatial dimension here, and in the ways in which Black folk in Brooklyn were organized, they were organized in clusters. You can think of it as large glumps, large groups of people. So in Brooklyn, you'd find there might be several streets with nothing but Black people, and then there'd be a street with 4-5 white people. Then there'd be another street with large numbers of Black folk and a few white people on the next street, right? So these clusters. Now, 61% of the Black folks in Brooklyn resided on those 23 lots that was initially purchased by John Baltimore. Within that space, where the 61% of the Black community resided, were the core institutions. Initially Brooklyn's AME, but it would at some point become Quinn Chapel AME Church and Antioch Antioch Missionary Baptist Church. That's where the Black businesses, the barbershops, and other Black businesses would be clustered, right? Later, as migrants came in from Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, they would set up in clusters. So that one of the things that I found most interesting is that I could find a street, and on that street, I would find the same family name for maybe 3 households. And then I'd find maybe different family names for a couple of households. But all of those folks would have been born in Tennessee or Kentucky or Missouri or Arkansas. So that they were organized by nativity, right? By the states that they came from. Now, in looking at the data and going through and tracking households, one of the interesting things is that you find a very low level of female-headed households, and indeed we know that that's a phenomena of the 1970s and 80s. That even when Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote that uh, immeasurably stupid document, the Negro Family Case for Action, 76% of his own data revealed that 76% of Black children were raised in two-parent households. But the point is that you can see the percentages there, right? Um, and then, of course, the church and business and these clusters. Moving on. Now, labor is, of course, if you pull back and you ask yourself very basic questions, right, about the significance of labor in Black life, the main thing you realize is that we were brought here to labor, right? You also very quickly understand that the United States is built by Black labor, right? So labor has been central. So in looking at labor and property ownership, the majority of Black workers were menial laborers working in the region, the Metro East region. There were no industries located in Brooklyn. And that's one of the things when we talk about underdevelopment we can speak to, because when one looked objectively at Brooklyn's location, when one looked objectively, right, at those kinds of things, it should have been the site for the terminus of a major railroad that would then go across the Mississippi River, right, and would bear coal because it was in the center of a large coal mining region. Yet, a town with a notorious reputation, Illinois town, which would eventually evolve into East St. Louis, was chosen rather than Brooklyn. And when you look at the history of Black towns in the West, you see the same phenomena, that many of them became underdevelopment or, in fact, died because the railroad didn't select them as the terminus, right, and chose to bypass them. So we see that relationship to industrial capital there. Property ownership, and again, what we see in Brooklyn, we know exists today in even a more heightened form. That's to say that you got a phenomena in which there is both extensive interracial stratification, meaning that Black people own far less than white folks do. That was true in Brooklyn. So, for example, in Brooklyn, of the Black property owners all together, they own $7,700 worth of property. But their wealth only came to 58% of just the 7 largest white Brooklynite property owners, right? But then if you turn around and you look internally, and here we're talking about intra-racially, you find that John Baltimore personally owned 26% of all African American real property, and that 4 men owned 68% of Afro Brooklynite real property. And by real property, I mean land and housing. We're not talking about whether or not people had jewels and cash. All right, moving on. So now we're going to move from the antebellum period into the period of emancipation and Black power. So the period from 1870 to 1906. And it is in this period that we're also going to talk about proletarianization, or the making of wage workers, right? And the coming of economic dependency, or I should say the consolidation of economic dependency. So Brooklyn is incorporated under the City and Village Act, which on August 2nd, 1873. Now, John Evans, who's the subject, he's the lens, he's the window through which we're going to watch these processes develop. The process by which Black people gain political control, and the process by which underdevelopment works, and the process by which Black people resist and struggle for a better life. So Evans is remembered in Brooklyn history as the father of Brooklyn. Mother Baltimore is Mother Baltimore because she leads the founding of Black Brooklyn, right? John Evans is father of Brooklyn because he becomes the first Black mayor and he builds the city's infrastructure, right? And he consolidates the freedom conscious culture. So between 1866 and 1910, Evans also had an importance beyond the city limits of Brooklyn. That's to say that he was a important statewide politician and, more importantly, political activist. Now, the way in which I was aware of Brooklyn, the place, because of a course I took, though there was very little data on it. And when I went down to investigate more, I was at the University of Illinois as a student. I go down to the East St. Louis Library, and they've got a clipping file on Brooklyn. So one of the articles that I discover one of the articles I discover in the East St. Louis Journal has this incendiary comment. It says, lively times are expected in our neighboring colored village. The few whites there, assisted by dissatisfied Negroes, will attempt to wrest the management of the government from the present Negro regime. Now, what intrigued me was just the language. It's incendiary, right? So it's in addition to the lower case, right, for the nomenclature for Black folk, but it says that they're going to wrest the government, not elect a different set of folk. They're going to wrest the government, and it's not a Black administration; it's a regime, right? And whenever you use the term regime, you're trying to suggest that it's illegal and corrupt. Moving on. So now, the article said nothing. It didn't give Evans' name, didn't say anything about him. He's completely in a shadow and silent. So that sparked me to want to find out, well, who are they talking about? Who is this Negro regime? And I wanted to more broadly, right, take this, what I consider to be a racist remark, and locate it within the history, within the social and cultural and the political context in which this journalist is making these comments. So this is what I discover. By 1890, when this article appears, John Evans has been the two-term president of Brooklyn's Board of Trustees. Now, when Evans becomes president in 1886, the tradition had been that the board amongst themselves would elect a president of the board. And because white people, despite being less than 1/7 of the population at this time, very, very small group, they continued to hold a 4-3 majority from 1874 to 1886. In 1886, 2 Black workers are elected, one of them being John Evans, and the Blacks now compose a majority, and Evans is elected president of the board. After serving 2 terms, two-year terms as president of the board, Evans puts forward a referendum. And the referendum is to have to abolish a board president and have a mayor and have the population, the public, which at that time we were black men, black and white men, vote for a mayor, and to expand the term from 2 years to 4. This is what prompts the comment in the East St. Louis Journal, a charter change. Now, what's interesting is that even though the city council, the township board of trustees had been dominated by whites in a 4-3 majority, at the exact same time, the school board had always been all black. School board had always been all black. All right, so with the election of Evans and Anthony Barnes, they get the black majority. The resolution passes. Now, in looking at that resolution, on the one hand, some scholars argue that Evans was simply attempting to solidify his position. But I would argue that it's a force for democratization because he puts the voting into the citizens' hands, right? Takes it out of the small group of elected people who compose the board, the village board, and puts the power back into the hands of the citizens of the town. So it was a democratic move, and objectively, it was an example of black power. Objectively, even though that term was not used at that point, right? Now, this is a turning point in the history of Brooklyn. Like I said, that the white population is by this time far less than 7/8, but after this resolution, the white population would dwindle to nil, right? Would dwindle to nil, so that you end up literally with a completely all black town, which is what it is today, right? Now, so it signaled opposite directions for two groups of folk, right? On the one hand, for that white wealthy group that had controlled the economy and the politics, it signals them being expelled from political control forever. For the black overwhelming majority, it signaled their rise to control of political power. The problem is that they don't also hold economic control. Right? Now, the initial response in 1891 is that and the failing to quote unquote wrest power from the black administration of John Evans in 1891, the few remaining whites and their African American allies petitioned to have Brooklyn, America's first black town, annexed by East St. Louis, thereby putting it out of existence and ending black control. Again, that fails, right? Because the African American male working class majority reject annexation. They want to remain an independent community, a self-governing municipality. Now, so again, I'm deeply intrigued by Evans and this 19th century guy, and so I want to know more about him. So I began to research more and more about Evans, the person, and not just Evans, the administrator, the mayor. And so the things that I discover lead me to this point. I felt when I did the dissertation, when I turned into a book, and I feel now, I feel a kinship, a closeness to this historical figure because one, we come from a similar class background and we have similar political commitments, right? And so I respect his accomplishments, but I also respect that he was willing to fight battles that he knew he would lose, but he felt it important to fight, right? To fight. And so one of the things I think his legacy teaches us is that we must always be on the battlefield, that we must fight. Because as Frederick Douglass says, nothing is ever seated without struggle. So in order to find out more about Evans, I went to the newspapers. And, it's interesting. Evans, even though he's mayor of Brooklyn, he only appears in the regional newspapers in his capacity as mayor. So he's not an elite who they cover what he does. He only appears when he's acting as mayor and he's trying to get some things done. And one could say that for the most part, that's the case in the Black press as well. I don't want to go deeply into these newspapers. You guys can have the PowerPoints. I'm just moving, trying to make the larger points, right? But I do want to say, well, you guys are in Arizona. Y'all really don't care about 19th century Black newspapers in Illinois. So let's move. All right. So that Evans became for me a way to use social history methodology to illuminate what one would call the unsung. That's to say, an individual whose story has not been told. As a working class person, John Evans doesn't leave a bunch of letters. He doesn't leave us with a diary. The way in which we come to know Evans is through public records. We know Evans through the census. We get to know Evans through city directories. We get to know Evans from speeches in newspapers. We get to know Evans in public sources and ways, right? Because working class people don't leave the kind of material that the bourgeois do. All right, moving on. So again, this is a reiteration of my point. So let's move on. Okay. So now the sources that I was able to access in terms of Evans, right? I could look for his probate record. I could look for marriage certificate, and I could track the household across from 1870, 1880, 1890, 19, I could trace his life over 60 years using census data. Right. And so while I can outline the structural aspects of his life, where he worked, when he worked, his level of education, how much real property he owned, and the positions that he held, those kinds of things, his ability to read and write. And of course, through the newspapers, I could get more into his philosophy, right? The way he understood things from the speeches that were reprinted and those kinds of things. And that allowed me to get some insight into his mentality, right? Moving on. Now, so again, this is a repetition of what I just said, so we can move. So when it comes to Evans, I'm confronted with this outsized image who's known as the father of Brooklyn, in the same way that Phyllis Priscilla Baltimore is mother of Brooklyn. And the question becomes, it's clear that he plays a leadership role in Brooklyn, but also in the state of Illinois. He plays a major role in the Afro-American Protective League, which there's at least 10, 12 chapters in the state of Illinois. These are Illinois state and local representations of T. Thomas Fortune's call for a national Afro-American League in 1890. And Fortune was calling for a league that would wage a battle on all fronts using all methodologies. So they did everything from write letters to the editor to take up arms to defend people. So it's a broad range group there. So the question becomes, what did John Evans represent, right? C.L.R. James had made the point. He said that leaders are important not for who they are, but for what they represent. Now, I hope you guys know James, right? C.L.R. James. He wrote probably the greatest book in the world, a book ever written, Black Jacobins. And James was studying Toussaint L'Ouverture and the San Domingo Revolution. And so one of the questions he engaged is, what is the role of leadership? And so James makes the argument that leaders are important not for who they are, but for what they represent. So my question became, what did John Evans represent? And what's important, right, is that Evans' life, his lived experiences, the fact that he had been a small farmer, failed, forced out by the coming of the meat packing, and just couldn't make it as a farmer. So he was forced into becoming a laborer at the railroad roundhouse, right? That he was a Southern migrant to Brooklyn. Those things mirrored the majority Black male population of Brooklyn. So in that sense, his experiences directly mirrored the people he represented. And that in part explains why he was so beloved, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of other people who had those same representations. So the argument I'm making is that if you didn't have those representations, it would be harder. So that he represented his people, right? Evans' occupational trajectory also mirrored a significant base of his folk. While in the 1850s, right, you had only 13% Black folk as farmers. By 1870, that had nearly tripled. You had 36%. But by 1880, it had fallen back to 13%. Evans' life mirrored that transition. It mirrored the ways in which industrial capital forced small farmers to enter the ranks of an industrial labor force. Right? And so you can look at the growth of this industrial labor force in Brooklyn between 1870 and 1890, and 1910, and you'll see that it literally grows to nearly 500 persons, and they represent 82%. Black laborers represent 82% of the employed Black male population. So he reflects that. So in 1880, he's a farmer. By 1891, he's unable to support his family as a farmer, and he's forced to take a job at the Wabash car repair shop. So he joins the ranks of the industrial working class. During his later years, he would rise up and become a shop floor supervisor. Moving on. And so Evans experienced the most common type of upward mobility that Black folks experience. Indeed, that working class people experience. That's to say that he moved within class segments. He moved from one segment of the Black working class, a small farmer, to a factory worker, right? To a floor supervisor. So he moved within that segment. And his occupation advances also echoed that of the town. Moving on. Right? Now, what's interesting is that if you look at most of the black towns out west, you generally had a middle class person, uh, often an entrepreneur, and even, I should say south and west. In Mountain Bayou, Isaiah P. Montgomery was mayor. He owned the newspaper, he owned the sawmill, he owned the bank, and he owned one other major industry, right? So that generally middle class people are emerging black bourgeois capitalists were the leadership in these black towns. In Brooklyn, it's a laborer, a worker, right? Person who ordinarily would have been unsung. All right, moving on. Now, obviously, one's personal attributes play a role. And so when we look at Evans, and here I want to say that Evans, that there's a whole series of men like Evans, Tazewell Bird, Anthony Barnes, that there's a whole series of these working folk, and we can go back, right, and pick up John Baltimore, a butcher. We can go back and pick up John Anderson, a carpenter, that there's a tradition of laboring men playing dominant roles in the community and in the politics of Brooklyn. Moving on, right? And so we know that class and gender, right, are implicated in the black experience just like race. But if we're looking at what we call the modal experience, that is to say, the most frequent experience of African descended people in the United States, the most frequent experience is as a member of the working class, whether it's an enslaved person, a sharecropper peon, a member of the industrial proletariat, or today, what we'll call the sub-proletariat, those people who labor in retail, fast food, transportation, distribution, non-union, benefitless, mainly contingent. That's to say that they are part-time and temporary. That is what makes up the bulk of the black laboring class today. That it's been for the African American people a working class experience across gender, across generation, regardless of ideology, etc. Right? Now, second, and this is another main point I want to make, is that these working class folks built institutions. They were always a component of leadership in every black community, and they're the base. They're the base, right? And they're responsible for launching most community building initiatives and they maintain also a class distinctive associational life and organizing resistance to white terrorism. It's not like Robin Kelly has said that they need to be led by the white, by the black middle class. No. They function independently. Right? And this is especially so in the middle-sized cities and small towns where most black folk reside. In fact, not just most, but the overwhelming majority of black folk in the 19th century resided, right? And so that we know that, for example, as late as 1910, 73% of black people resided in rural areas and in small towns. Let's move on. In 1870, in 1880, in 1900, and in 1910, the Black middle class composed 0.5, 0.7, 1.3, and 2.3% of the African American population. They did not have substantive wealth. They did not have great power. And so it's actually intellectually criminal to propose that this small class that was also consolidated in a few cities on the East Coast, that they were able to control and dominate local communities, right? It simply doesn't hold up in moving on. And when you do the fine grain research, like I did in Brooklyn, like Joe William Trotter did in Black Milwaukee, like Kimberly Phillips did in Alabama North, and then a host of, I would dare say that if you look at all of the major Black urban community studies that emerged from the late 1970s through today, that when you dig deep, right, you'll find that the people leading those organizations tend to be working class. Definitely the participants, all one has to do is look at the pictures of the people who marched during the Montgomery bus boycott. All right, so the point is that we have to understand that this broad-based class led in the formation of fraternal orders. I'm not talking Alpha, APs. I'm talking Elks. I'm talking Eastern Star. I'm talking those kind of fraternal orders, not the Kappas and the Deltas. Okay, church affiliated groups, and indeed in race advancement groups through the civil rights and Black Power era. That these were largely working class people. Moving on. Okay. So then, what is it that Evans represented? John Evans represented a man who put forth, okay, what I got here is a list of accomplishments. So one of the things he does is he gets Brooklyn's electricity, and he gets it before many of the white towns around Brooklyn, right? He succeeds in expanding the town's borders so that there can be an autonomous cemetery. He rebuilds, or actually he builds a brick town hall building. And in addition to his infrastructural changes, and there are many, he also hosts a large regional emancipation day. And I list this only to put to make a shift to culture, because the Emancipation Day celebrations is an example of a freedom consciousness, right? And so Brooklyn began as an anti-slavery community. And what Evans is doing is continuing that legacy through Emancipation Day celebrations. I'm not going to go into the detail. We keep moving. All right. And so we come to the point where John Evans dies at the age of 55, July 30th, which incidentally is my birthday. Another reason, the kind of identification, little quirks, right? So July 30th, 1910, at age 55, he dies. He dies relatively poor. He had on hand $167.66 in his bank account, $5 in a savings account, $40 in an interest, $40 of interest on a bank fund, and $38 of personal effects. John Evans' wife, who was consistently listed as literate in the census from 1890 to 1910, we discover that as administratrix of her husband's account, that she signs the paperwork, the probate papers, with an X. she could read but couldn't write. And again, this just reinforces the capacity of working people, that she was able to function and make contributions in that context. But it also says that he didn't seek a bourgeois spouse. Moving on. So Evans leaves us with a complex legacy. First, he struggled to build Brooklyn into a bastion of Black power. They seized control of the town. They were a Black majority, an overwhelming majority, and they were subjugated by what one could call a form of domestic colonialism. And they overthrew white control and took control. He led that process. He's the central force behind that. As mayor, he dedicates to improving the infrastructure of the town. They get street lights. They build a new post office, a new town hall. He pushes a freedom conscious culture, right? They're not just pushing a simulation. He's emphasizing the aspects of Black culture that focus on the need to be free, right? During his administration, they have to arm themselves for invasion, to prevent an invasion from whites, the surrounding cities. Evans preached and practiced protests from the mayor's office, and he's deeply involved statewide in all kinds of political struggles and other forms of attack on local Black communities. Moving on. So Evans' life and career represents Afro-Brooklynites, and it embodies a broader working class Black proto-nationalist politics that existed during what Rayford Logan called the nadir, 1877 to 1924. That Evans' story of militant struggle, his effort to build community culturally, and to build it in material, concrete terms, in terms of constructing literally infrastructure, right? That reflected a dominant tendency amongst working class African American activists at that time. And so when we recover the story of men and women like John Evans, Black working class men and women, it helps us to tell a more accurate portrait, to draw a more accurate portrait, to tell a more accurate story of the thought and actions of the majority of African American people. So, what I would say is that far from being lost, we are capable of recovering the lives, ideas, and actions of working class men and women like John Evans. And we can do it through the traditional social history method. And so what I would urge is that if you guys begin to write the history of Blacks in Falstaff, Arizona, and other other communities, that you resist the fashionable tendency to emphasize the Black middle class, or to focus on the underclass, or what was once called the underclass. I don't know what they call them now, other than thugs, but focus on the working Black population and what they did to build institutions, maintain institutions. So Brooklyn, what does it mean? Brooklyn, like other Black towns, was an expression of Black people's desire for self-determination, Black folks' desire for self-definition and self-development to control their own destiny. Brooklyn like other Black towns, inherited a history and inherited a set of social relationships that were quite complex. And there was a deep interplay between um, an evolving capitalist economy, a developing, or I should say, an oscillating federal system of government, and Black folks' self-agency, of capacity to act in their own interest. And in that context, there's struggle, nothing but struggle. And that Brooklyn's history demonstrates the activity and the organizational capacity of working class Black people to act in their interests and to lead the Black community. Okay, that may be it. All right.
That was amazing, Doctor. And we are certainly excited to dive into some questions and considering this history. One of the things you said earlier, I think, as we were just trying to work through and get through the back half of your presentation, was that we out here in Flagstaff might not care about some of the newspaper history of John Evans, but I can assure you we very much do. That's exactly why we do these presentations. And not only that, but as you were presenting, we were doing some digging because our mayor out here in Flagstaff a few years ago was Dr. Coral Evans. And in seeing the name John Evans as the first Black mayor of Brooklyn, we started to make some parallels. So one of the questions actually that came in was, do we know where John Evans was born or where he originated?
Virginia.
Okay.
Virginia. There's a strange relationship between Virginia and the population that comes into Illinois. Many of the early white settlers also came out of Virginia. You know, Virginia in the 18th century and 19th was much larger than it is now. And so when the Midwest is carved up, Virginia loses some of its territory. But Evans was one of many Black folk who came out of Virginia into Brooklyn.
Okay. One of the things that was really interesting was just, drawing so many of the parallels between the story of Brooklyn, Illinois, and Flagstaff, Arizona. Not because of just the shared history of our respective Mayor Evanses, but also just the interesting parallels with the location of Brooklyn being in, you identified it as a floodplain adjacent to the railroad. That's very much the story of Flagstaff as well, particularly the historic Black community of Southside in Flagstaff is in a floodplain adjacent to the railroad. And so just the stories of how, just like the title of this said, being founded by chance, sustained by courage, and the importance of the development of both Black neighborhoods and Black cities and towns. I want to ask, I guess, about the significance of that, why it's so significant for these towns to have been developed and what that tells us about kind of the placement of Black culture in America, and how we work to preserve that cultural identity in America by the development of these places and spaces within it.
Well, the first thing that it shows is that it shows our humanity, right? Resistance is perhaps one of the most human things you can do, because what it says is that I have people that I love and care and have concern for, and I'm not going to allow certain things to be done to them that dehumanizes them, right? So resistance is a deep expression of love. So if we look at African American history, and I want to work post enslavement, right?
Mhm.
So the first social movement that emerges amongst African Americans is the Exodus of 1879. And that's a movement of Black folks from the South into largely into Kansas and Oklahoma. And they began to set up their own towns. And they're responding to the overthrow of Reconstruction and the murderous rampage that that spreads throughout the South in that period. So this form of exodus became an expression of resistance. Resistance isn't always about guns and fighting. You can fight. There's many tools, right, to fight with. The vote. I mean, there are many tools, but Exodus is one tool. And then, given the rampant argument that we were incapable of self-government, the move to set up our own towns, one, it puts us in control. So I think that that's the thrust, but it also becomes a refutation of the racist intellectual slanders against our people. Right? And then when we look at what happens in those towns, the studies of most Black towns shows that there was very little crime all the way through the 1960s. I should say into the 1960s. We have very little crime. Now, part of it is that these are smaller communities. Maybe some of them top out at excuse me, at several thousand. But the point is, there's when we controlled that space, we were able to create a set of social relationships that eliminated features in places where we are deeply exploited and oppressed. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So so those things, plus ultimately in Black towns like at Black College, I went to Tooele. Um, at Black colleges, Black young folk get a chance to be in charge. They get to lead things. On white colleges and campuses, the only things we get to lead are Black student associations, et cetera, et cetera. And those things are generally very, very small and have very little capacity in terms of resources and have very little impact. At a Black college, you get to be head of student government, right? So in a Black town, people get to develop. There's a 1 minute and 20-second clip taken during the 1930s of, I think it's Boley, Oklahoma, Black town. You can just pull it up, and it's an amazing thing in terms of what it shows about the prosperity. Now, we know that ultimately through white racism and capitalism, they would undermine, but what you see is that when you come from a space where you've been allowed to develop your leadership, there's a confidence that develops. So I would argue that Black towns are important for all of those things, and most importantly, because people have to have the right to make their own decisions. And Black towns gave us that space where we could make decisions. If we made bad decisions, we suffered for it, but it was our decisions. And what we see, what the history shows, is that we largely made very good decisions.
We had a question come in from an Instagram viewer, and it was, what saved Brooklyn from being burned down like Rosewood or drowned like Central Park? What made them so resistant to being destroyed?
In 1903, the black school teacher in Brooklyn went into Belleville, Illinois, and it's unclear what happened. The white people say that he immediately drew a gun and shot the school superintendent who had his family's story, and Ida B. Wells' story, is that he went to protest his termination, and white men there, you know, one of them reached for a gun, so he reached for his, and he shot the superintendent, and they ultimately lynched him, and they planned to come into Brooklyn. Well, John Evans, they had, in anticipation, they had purchased a bunch of shotguns from St. Louis, and they simply blocked off their community and made it clear, you can come, but some of you gonna die. And they had developed that legacy in history. And I would argue that that more than anything explains it. That the places where black people were massacred are in situations where sheriffs came in and they disarmed the black population.
Mm-hmm.
They stopped selling ammunition to black people weeks before, right? We were caught off guard. That didn't happen in Brooklyn. We weren't off guard.
That goes back to something that I was wondering about at the beginning of before we started. I was talking with Miss Bernadine, and we were just talking about the fact that I personally had not heard of Brooklyn, Illinois, before starting to read a bit in preparation for the session, and it occurred to me that as little history as we get about Black towns and Black cities in America, the ones that we do tend to hear the most about are the ones that were destroyed. And that seems almost systemic, or like there's a reason why we get to hear about the ones that no longer exist or were destroyed versus ones like this that prospered and still exist to this day. So do you think there's a reason behind that distinction between what we hear about and what we don't, I guess?
Well, I think that there's always a reason, but I don't want to create a false history in terms of Brooklyn, right? There is a period in which Brooklyn goes down. It goes down after 1915. That's why I kept making the point about the interface between political autonomy and economic underdevelopment.
Mm-hmm.
That Brooklyn is systematically underdeveloped because it doesn't attract industry, right? And the whites, they had the same kind of resentments toward Brooklyn that they had toward Rosewood. But there is a period when it thrives. Mm-hmm. And what I tried to do was chronicle that era before we charted the decline. And I would argue that you could do this. What happens with Rosewood is that, scholars need to go back and track Rosewood before the massacre, mm-hmm. right? That we always have to tell a full story. Mm-hmm. But the main reason why we don't hear about Black towns, because the existence of a Black town, if it's successful, creates the notion that Black people are able to run things and do things for themselves. That's a dangerous idea in the United States. And so we've always, again, if you go back and you look at who are the individuals that we get introduced to in school in terms of Black. It's not those who believed that we needed to organize ourselves, that we needed to always stand up, that we needed to build. Those of us who wanted to become part of white America. And so, you know, there's always going to be shade cast on those people who sought autonomy. You know, I found something very interesting. I mean, this might be a little too far to the side, but it's an interesting point. The current attacks on John Boye are kind of makes no sense, because if he says he likes Black women, that's fine, right? It should be. So why are people concerned and attacking him for making a comment that he dates Black women, right? And this is the same thing in terms of Black folks trying to do stuff for themselves, then that's a problem. And so when it comes to these Black towns, they're considered to be unimportant. You know, even to I mean, you can find more books, more articles on repatriation, meaning those African Americans, those Black folks in the U.S. who returned to Africa. Now, that's a very important social movement in our history, right? Mm-hmm. The names of the people, Paul Cuffey, Martin Delaney, Henry Highland, Martin Delaney, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, Marcus Garvey. But only 4,000 Black folks ever left the U.S. and went back to the African continent before the 1960s. But 100,000 moved to Black towns. But you got far more work on those people who immigrated in the immigration movement than those who built Black towns. How do you account for that given the breadth of the disparity, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Another audience question. They said, when you speak of not emphasizing the underclass, is that akin to the current trend of glorifying the struggle culture? We sometimes speak with nostalgia of the old days when we struggled as a community and expect our younger generations to struggle to a point as well.
I'd need that person to elaborate what they mean by struggle culture, because I thought that there were two different things being asked in that question. One is this notion of this struggle culture, and am I comparing that to by underclass, that I mean this struggle culture, and then the other is the critique of of an older generation of a younger generation. So I need some clarification.
All right, we'll see if they can, I know they're watching, so we'll see if they can put in some further information on that.
Okay, I can start.
Yeah.
I'll start from what I presume is being said, right? So I'm going to start with what's easy, which is the critique of an older generation of a younger generation. First, it is true that every older generation has critiques of every younger generation, but that doesn't mean that some of them aren't valid, right? The question is, how do we make those critiques? I'm very, very critical of young people, millennials, particularly the younger half of millennials and Generation Z. But my critique isn't like a Bill Cosby critique that's simply rooted in behavior. I'm not Michael Eric Dyson and just saying silly stuff in that regard. My critique is based on the changes that have happened due to political economy, right? So one of the things, and can you let me, can I have some time here, like 5 minutes to
Yeah.
make the point? A couple of weeks ago, I went to the wake and the funeral of a childhood friend, someone that I've known for over 60 years. I'm from a community, Decatur, Illinois, the south side of Decatur, Illinois. During Bruce Mann's funeral, various people come in, judge him, shouted Southside, Southside, Southside. We feel like there's something unique for the generation of people who grew up who were born in the 50s and grew up in the 60s and became adults in the 70s in Decatur, Illinois. And here's what we know. We know that we grew up in a community in which there was a Black working class that controlled social institutions. So they controlled the park. You could regularly go to Southside Park. Its official name was Mueller, but we as Black people refused to call it after Mueller because the Mueller company didn't employ Black people. And you could have 1,000 people in the park watching a baseball game. Concession stands controlled by Black people, Black folks all around. There's every team, every type of athletic team is operating out of that park, controlled by older Black men, right? In a community in which it's composed of large extended families, you know. Most of them, not my family, but almost every other Black family in Decatur came up from Haywood County, Tennessee, Brownsville. They were the descendants, actually, no, they weren't descendants, they were the participants themselves of the major cotton producing county in Tennessee. And they themselves were sharecroppers. I should say their parents were sharecroppers, and they were recruited in by industry in the Decatur into these hard working class jobs in foundries. And they built a tight knit community in which inside the community there were Black businesses. I'm not just extolling Black business, but they were in the community, right? And that community was shattered by a series of events, plans. The first is urban renewal, the Highway Act. I myself moved twice because the building of the highway tore up the neighborhood in which I was in. Urban renewal took out most of the Black business district. Well, actually, yeah, damn near all of the Black business district in my town. So between the building of the highways and urban renewal, they shattered the community. And then in 1979, as the economy is shifting toward the information economy and away from an industrial economy, you suddenly have massive unemployment, people losing jobs because the factories are leaving. And at some point, the factories are all gone by the time we get into the mid 90s, actually. Now, in that context, the community that I lived in that was so tight knit was tight knit because of the economics of the community, right? Um, this younger generation grows up in an era in which Black churches have half or less of their membership. Black associations where kids used to be trained. The parks that I used to live in, by the time I was a late teen or a actually, no, by the time I was a young adult, the police raided the parks consistently, and we had to move from park to park because they were shutting down any place where there was a large gathering of Black folk. So these kids have not grown up in spaces of Black cooperation, in spaces in which Black people controlled. They've grown up in war zones, and they've grown up without jobs, right? And yet they got to still eat and feed. And so they've grown up in a different context. So part of my critique is the ways in which the transition to financialized global racial capital has ravaged this society, the world, but particularly our people. And part of my critique is that um, these young people have been more accepting of being assimilated into American ideas
Mhm.
in our generation, because those are the institutions they've been incorporated into. So I think that the critique at our level is not simply about, whether or not I think one should sag with their pants or tie their shoes. That's irrelevant to me. What's more relevant is the question of whether or not one tries to understand that the situation that they're in is a product of conscious behavior on the part of those who want to destroy us, and one is trying to do something to thwart that agenda as opposed to carry out that agenda by being the executioner of ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And sorry for the length that I took to make that point.
No, that's perfect. And it sounds like the person who asked the question, Miss Kim Robinson, said exactly just the older generation critiques of younger. So I think you hit her question right on the head. So thank you for that. Um, I want to wrap up then with a question about you started with the concept of proto-nationalism. And I think it's a good place to bring us back to. So in just looking up proto-nationalism, one of the definitions for it was the belief that a particular culture or ethnic group constitutes a distinct people deserving of political self-determination. And what I really got kind of stuck on was the phrase deserving of political self-determination. So I'm curious about that distinction of being deserving of. What does that mean to you in particular for Black self-determination, self-definition, to be deserving of that distinct identity and definition? And how do you see the development of Black cities and towns? And if we take it back even to like neighborhoods and settlements and all of those places where we strove to have that sense of self-determination, what's the significance of that deserving aspect?
I actually have deep problems with that because I believe that all people are deserving of self-determination.
Mhm.
I think that if there is an identifiable group, they deserve the right to determine their destiny. I don't think that any other group has the right to impose their will on another group.
Mhm.
So I find that a little odd, right? Uh, but if we pull away from just that phrase, I, I think that there's two ways that we approach this. One is there's something that the proto-nationalist piece gives us space in that what we're saying is that we want to control our communities. Mr. Malcolm X position, right? That Black communities, politically, socially, economically, culturally, we should control them. That means that uh, we need to control the media. That means we need to own the community, the media,
Mhm.
and that our children are introduced to. It means that we need to be in control of the educational process, right? It means that we have to be able to make the political decisions that largely affect the African American community. Now, that's a lot in this sense, because it means the creation of new institutions and it means the reconstruction of existing institutions in order to make them vehicles for democracy and decision making. Um, right now, right, the problem isn't that, or it isn't just that we overwhelmingly vote democratic is that we don't have a process where we collectively fight for a political ideal within this society. So, for example, if we want to control our own destiny, shouldn't we be fighting around the concept of proportional representation?
Mm.
In every community, we should, at a minimum, be represented by our percentage in that society, our electorate. That's, you go into Scandinavia, they have things structured on that basis that you are represented as a group. We're a group, just like American Indians. We're not individuals in American society. I know a lot of people wish we were, but we're not.
Mm.
White people will never see us as individuals. They see us as members of a group. And so the question is then, if we are members of a group and our fate is tied to each and every member, and in fact, right, what they think about each and every one of us is determined by what they think about the lowest of us,
Mm.
right? The worst idea they have about a black person, that's the idea that we are all ultimately judged by.
Mm.
That's the reality. Um, and so what proto-nationalism means is that we have to rebuild institutions. Every necessary life-giving institution we have to construct or take control of such that it benefits our people. And we need to do that in a way in which that is not just a material gain, but that is rooted in African American culture, that we build out from our culture. We've always had a cooperative culture, and that culture is being shredded. The kind of communal um, culture that I was describing that existed in my hometown that's been shredded. And it's not that it's been shredded just by these younger people. It's been shredded by the United States' its social cultural institutions. And I'll give you a simple example. Name for me a group, a musical group.
Oh, goodness.
You know,
Yeah.
looking at you, I know that you probably grew up with New Edition, right? You know something about the Temptations, Supremes, right? Commodore. You don't have groups anymore.
Hmm.
What does that mean, right?
Yeah.
Even the gangs aren't gangs anymore; they're small sets. What that means is that it's the questions around around collectivity and cooperation. You know, that ethos don't necessarily that is shriveling. That's what I should say. That ethos of collectivity is shriveling, and it's shriveling because people are being incorporated into white American capitalist individualism.
Mm.
So we can see it easiest by simply looking at musical culture because we're used to having those bands, those groups, and seeing that don't exist anymore
Mm.
because the individual can make more money and the corporation would rather sign the individual and then have the individual pay the members as opposed to the group. But that tears at the fabric of a people who are communal, the people who are used to collectivity. And so those things are being rendered. And that's the problem that I have with the younger generation is that they're not struggling to take the threads of our past, those things that sustained us, right? Sustained by courage, and they're not working to reweave that fabric by which we built community and
Mm.
sustained ourselves, that they are in fact participating in its unraveling because they don't see the value.
Mm.
So that's the only critique I have on the young, um, that we cannot, to the extent that we are individualized, is the extent to which we will disappear in this society. And I don't mean fade; I mean be eliminated.
Yeah.
And if anyone doesn't understand what the United States is rapidly becoming,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah.
um, we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of Tulsas
Mm.
and okay,
Yeah.
Rosewoods. That's what's being generated in this society. If you're listening to these speeches and this crazy talk, Hugh and I,
Mm. Yeah. So, true last question then. I think this is an even better one then for where we are now in this conversation is where do we start to do that, to regain that collective sense? I think we've talked a lot with the LBE series about the concept of Sankofa and not being afraid to go back and get what we need from the past for our present. It sounds like what we need is that sense of community and collective and gaining that back. So where do we start with trying to recapture that?
well, I'm going to say that doing this series that you guys are doing is a very, very good start. But it begins with we have to take control of the education in our community. Jewish people have what they call Saturday schools. Other cultures have the same thing, right? We don't have enough investment to create a schooling system from whole cloth. So we're stuck with the public schools, but we can create supplemental education that teaches culture and teaches a different sense of what's correct by running Saturday schools that are infused where you infuse African American history and culture and, and behavior.
Mhm.
I think that every existing organization and institution, that clubs and et cetera, that they have to begin to rethink what can they do to recreate greater cooperation and concern. And it may begin with your membership, but at some point it needs to evolve out so that it doesn't end up just being a middle class circle. But in other ways, we have to just be attentive to what our people are doing, right?
Mhm.
As the economy has worsened, our people have responded and they've responded very creatively. So the extended family is being recreated, right? Children are being forced to move back in with their parents,
Mhm.
right? Now, children might hate it, but at the end of the day, we were at our best when we had extended families that had grandparents, uncles and aunts, cousins, nieces and nephews, right? Those large clans, whether you all live in the same house or you live next door to each other in the same, that's the way we've lived. And
Yeah.
that's a very African way of living. Okay. So we're beginning to see those kinds of things reemerge. And the shame is that right now it's being forced by the economic conditions, right? As opposed to being a political, cultural choice.
Mhm.
But what we have to do is validate those forms so that rather than it being a negative critique, oh man, you had to move back in with your parents. No, now that you've moved back in with your parents, think about the things that you can do to help the whole group,
Yeah.
right? You can work with a nephew. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
We have to begin to put a positive spin on those things that we do to survive because what we're falling back on are the cultural traditions that help make us uh, that helped us to survive.
Mhm.
And so I say take a deeper look at what's happening in the community, what the people are instinctively doing, and find ways to accent the most positive attributes of it and and spread it and push it. And we have to begin to understand that there was a time when you might have been, you had this church and you had 500 people. Well, now you got 40. So maybe you don't need an independent church. Maybe you need to find some like-minded people and form a broader. I mean, we've got to understand that we got to reconsolidate things. And it's okay if you have to let something go to join with some other people to keep the ideas, right? The thrust of it alive. That we've got to be in the process of rebuilding, recreating, remolding, and not simply trying to keep something alive that now really only exists in name only.
Mm.
So, I mean, those are simple things because none of us have a plan. But what we do know is we know what the values are, and we know that the goal has to be to increase cooperation amongst ourselves and our ability to control space and resources and to make collective decisions.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Miss Bernadine, I want to check and see if you had any closing thoughts or wanted to close us out, or you're on mute.
I I'm just happy. This is a wonderful way to get back on track.
Mhm.
I truly feel that coming back with the new season, that this definitely has served to educate, inform, and enlighten our listeners. And so I would just like to remind uh, Flagstaff, Arizona, all of our listeners who have supported this platform to continue that we're back and to continue to come back and be a part of what it is that we have to share. Thank you, good doctor, for um, enlightening us this evening. Your presence, your presentation truly has been a blessing. Thank you for what you are doing on your side of the world. Thank you for being willing to come and share with us on this side of the world. And we do wish that we can invite you back. This has been very insightful. And for that, this evening, we are the bettered. Um, we are we are definitely where we are supposed to be, and we are heading where it is that we need to go. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation and feel free to contact me anytime.
Thank you. Sister Kara, is there anything that you would say as we close this evening?
I'll just say this has been, I mean, absolutely an amazing session and an amazing return back. I think when we started doing these, we started with the story of Juneteenth and what that meant for our community. And it seems like every kind of season that we have with these sessions, we always have an opening that kind of rekindles the fire of
Yeah.
what these are all about. And just starting from that place of uh, community and needing to get back to some of that collective sense of community is really, I think, a wonderful place for us to start this season. So I know we always close with uh, uh, go in grace. And I think for this one, I would just add go and come and stay in community as well. It's just, I think that is the message that we're starting with this time. And it's a beautiful one for us to be launching with.
Indeed it is, and that is a beautiful closing, and just one more thing to add to that, that the lived Black experience is always looking for accomplices. And so we invite the community, the world community, the regional community to come join us. If it is an experience, a story that you have to share, then please contact us. Um, and if it is to learn and to become enlightened and informed and educated, definitely join us. And so, with that being said, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back, and we'll see you again.